Hi everyone, welcome back to our continuing series in developing Game Boy games in C using the Game Boy Developer Kit. Today we're going to look at developing Game Boy Color games. Lots of you have asked for this, so I'm going to start off showing you how to use colours in your sprites. Let's get started. So I've actually taken some inspiration from a Twitter user here that I found. This guy here called Frizzle Freeze, and he's created a few characters that I wanted to kind of play around with. And what I've done is used Game Boy Tile Designer, which hopefully you've seen me use before. If not, I'll put a link below into the playlists and you can go and have a look at how we use this and how we create tiles with it. But I've done a few things different today. So I've actually gone into View, changed tile size to be 8 by 16. So normally the tiles I show you are 8 by 8. But actually in the Game Boy you can set a mode where all the tiles are loaded as if they're 8 by 16. So you can see I've drawn 3 characters here from the game Day of Tentacle. If you've ever played that, it's an awesome game. I thought it'd be quite fun to include them in here. And I've done another thing in here. So I've gone into View, Color Set, and I've changed it to Game Boy Color. And what that does is rather than just having the 4 Game Boy colors that you have down here, I now have 8 tile sets that I could use. The Game Boy Color can use 8 different tile sets made up of 4 different colours. Now it still has the same limitation that each 8 by 8 sprite, in this case 8 by 16 sprite, can only use 4 colours. But you can, if you create meta sprites, again there's a video about meta sprites, you could create 4 colours in one part of the meta sprite and 4 different colours in the other. So you can actually introduce different colours, more than 4 colours in your character and make it look like there are more. So I've just drawn them in here and I've used a different palette for each character so I can kind of match to their colours. So the way that I've done that again is go into View, Palettes. And for each palette you can choose a colour and then use the colour picker here or type them in here to actually set your colours. Now if you've been used to using graphics packages, this would normally be like hexadecimal would be 255, 255, 255. In this, it's 31, so it's 32 colours between 0 and 32. So you're going to have to kind of play around with those to try and match your designs. But I just picked them out of here and then drew each one of my characters. So I'm only going to use 3 of the 8 possible palettes today. So I've got my different palettes. Each one of these has a different palette. Now we need to do some things in the export. So if you go to File, Export To, most of this is the same as normal. I've called it Sprites. I've given it a label of Sprites. I'm exporting from 0 to 2 and I'm choosing the Game Boy 4 color format. That's all as we would normally do it. But if we go into Advanced here, I've now ticked this Include Color Palettes and I've changed this to be 1 byte per entry. I'm not looking at the Super Game Boy palettes today, we're just going to show you the Color Game Boy palettes, but we might come back to that in future. But you can see that's all I really need to change, and then when I do a normal file export, it'll create my files. So let's go and have a look at the code. So I created a typical file that we'd use for loading in sprites, but I've done a few extra things here. So I'm bringing in my sprites, what you just saw me export. I'm setting this special method called Sprites 8 by 16, tells the Game Boy that I'm using 8 by 16 sprites. Then I'm loading in sprite data, but rather than loading in 3, because they're 8 by 16 sprites, I have to load in 6, because effectively it is actually 6 8 by 8 sprites. Then I'm setting the tile data for the first sprite to start at the first entry in my sprite data. It will automatically work out it needs to use 2. And then I'm moving the sprite, and I'm just doing that for my 3 different characters. Then I'm turning on sprites and turning on the background. So when we compile that and open up BGB, you'll see I get this. So at the moment it's not using colours at all, it hasn't got the palettes. In fact, the palettes are a bit messed up because it's just using the default Game Boy palettes. So we're going to have to fix that to load in some palettes and actually to tell BGB that we're using the Game Boy Color. So the first thing to do is to right click and do Options and then choose Game Boy Color here. So once you've done that, it's still going to look the same because we haven't got those palettes loaded. But this is a good time to point out, if you're trying to do a game that works on the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color, then you're going to have to use the order in which you use your colours in your colour tile set to be more like the Game Boy, where it starts with the light colour and ends with the dark colour. Otherwise you end up with what I've got here, where the colours just look a bit weird on the Game Boy, whereas on the Color they'll look fine. So just make sure you order your colours, which I haven't done in this example, from light to dark, and then it will look fine on the Game Boy. So if we go and have a quick look at what was exported with Sprites, you'll see it exported this, which is a Sprites color map. We're not going to use that for Sprites, but when we look at backgrounds in future we'll use that. And it's exported the Sprite data like it normally would. But then if we look in the H file, it's exported all of my palettes as these defines. So you've previously seen me use constants. They're things that don't ever change. Defines are a little bit different. They work in a similar way, but actually what happens is before it gets compiled, something called a preprocessor, it's going to go through, and wherever it finds me using this in my code, it's going to replace it with this value here, which is a color value. So we're going to use these to actually build up our palettes, and they're already in the H file, but that means we've got to use the H file. So normally when you've seen this, I usually use the C file directly. It's simpler, but actually as you get more into doing the Game Boy, you should start to understand you should start to use these header files, these .h files. It will handle better in compiling when you're doing bigger games. So we include sprites.h, but we also have to go and make a change to our make.bat, our compiling file. And what we have to do is actually do this line here. So normally we would have this line, and now we need to do sprites.c is to sprites.o, and that will make sure that the header file can actually find the code behind that. So you have to add that new line. You'll also notice I've changed something here as well. I've added sprites.o, which is what gets compiled out of here, alongside main.o. So that'll end up in the final ROM. And I've also added this line here. So this line here tells the compiler that this is for the Game Boy Color. So you need to make sure you include that in your final line there. So back into the code. I haven't really changed anything. I've just kind of talked through what we've got there. So what we're first going to do is to create a background palette. So we're going to define it as a constant like we normally do for anything that isn't going to change, so that we make sure it ends up in the ROM, not the RAM. We're going to use a new type called a U word. Now I've only started to really understand what these are. So as far as I understand on the Game Boy, a U word represents 4 bytes. And so we're going to do an array of U words. So we're going to call that Sprite Palette. So it's an array, so we do the square brackets, and we're going to set it equal to, and we're actually going to fill that array here. Make sure you include the semicolon there. So as I said, it's 4 bytes, so we're going to actually put in 4 bytes from here, from our color palette, for each of these color palettes, and we need these 3 color palettes. So I'm going to put them in here. Make sure you indent your code just so it's nice and readable. So all I've done there is to take these individually, 4 of them for each palette, and put them in here with commas, but I'm just putting spacing in so I remember that they're in 4s. It doesn't really care how I'm putting them in as long as they're in order like that. So that's the first one. I'm also going to create a background palette just so I can change the background color as well. So I'm just going to do exactly the same, but I'm just going to fill it with the same color for each, because I just need a solid colored background. I don't care that there's a different palette. So we do exactly the same again, but this time called background palette. But I don't want to create any colors in here. I'm going to use some built-in colors. So I'm going to pull in an extra file that's included in GBDK. So I'm going to do a new include here, which is going to go to GB Color Game Boy. And this, if we go and have a look at it, if you hold down Control in Visual Studio Code and click on it, holds a whole load of pre-built colors like this that I can reuse. So I'm just going to use 4 of those just for one color palette for the background. And they're all just going to be dark grey. I don't really care that they're different colours. You'll see how we use that in a second. So the first thing I am going to do is to actually set the background palette. We're not going to go into how we can do different colour background palettes today. That will be for a future video, but I just need a background that's not plain white. So we're going to use a function we've not seen before called set Bkg Palette. We're going to tell it to start at the first palette in our background palette collection, so 0, and we only want to load 1 palette, so 1 that we're going to load. And then what we're going to do is give it a pointer. So when you do it a pointer, remember, you do an ampersand in front of it, background palette, and we're going to get the first U word. That's what we're telling it to go and get. So it'll actually figure out if you're loading more than 1 palette to go on to each U word, but it's going to get that first palette, which is in this case the only palette we've got in here, this 4. Okay, so if I was to compile that now and reload, we get a grey background like we wanted. That's the first step. So now we're actually going to do a pretty similar thing to how we did the background palettes here, but we're going to load in the sprite palettes. So we're going to use a similar method, set sprite palette, again starting at 0, but this time we're going to load all 3 of our sprite palettes in. And again we can use a pointer to point to those, and we're going to start with the first U word in it. So that will load all of those 4 palettes into the Game Boy's Color palette menu. So now all we have to do for each sprite is to actually tell it which palette to use. So we do that using a method called set sprite prop, set sprite property effectively. And the first thing that needs is which sprite. So this sprite is the 0 sprite, the first sprite. And then we're going to tell it which palette to use. So we want the first sprite to use the first palette. And we're going to do the same down here. So we're going to let the second sprite use the second palette. Again, these are all 0 indexed, so it's not 2, it's 1. Okay, so now we load the tile data into a sprite. We set the sprite property to the palette, and then we're just carrying on moving the sprite like we did before. So if we run that now, and load it up in GBD, there you go. Each one's got its own palette, just like we drew it up here. So you can see Purple Tentacles using his palette, Doctor's using his palette, and I can't remember the name, is it Hoagie? I think it is. He's using his palette. So that's really all there is to using palettes in the Game Boy Color. So you can do up to 8 palettes. As I said, you could split your actual character up into multiple tiles using meta tiles and do different colours in each one, but this gives you a basic understanding of how to load colours into your sprites. That's all for now. Make sure you hit subscribe and like, and we'll see you next time.